By the winter of 1944, the war in Europe had entered a phase that many Allied leaders believed was only a matter of time. Just 6 months earlier, the massive amphibious landings of D-Day had opened a second front in Western Europe. Since then, Allied armies had pushed relentlessly across France, liberating city after city and forcing German forces into a long retreat toward their own borders. The once unstoppable war machine of Nazi Germany appeared to be cracking under pressure from all sides. To the east, the Red Army was advancing toward Germany with overwhelming strength. To the west, American, British, and Canadian forces were gathering along a wide front that stretched from the North Sea to the dense forests of Belgium and Luxembourg. Supply lines had grown long and complicated, but the momentum seemed unstoppable. Many Allied soldiers believed the war might be over by Christmas. But inside the headquarters of Adolf Hitler, a very different conversation was taking place. Hitler understood that Germany could not win a long war anymore. Its cities were under constant bombing, fuel reserves were shrinking, and experienced soldiers were becoming harder to replace. Yet Hitler was not thinking about surrender. Instead, he was searching for one dramatic blow that could change everything. His idea was bold, risky, and almost unbelievable in its ambition. Germany would launch a surprise offensive through the thick forests of the Ardennes, smashing through the thinly defended Allied lines. Armored divisions would race west at maximum speed, cross the Meuse River, and drive all the way to the port of Antwerp. If the plan succeeded, it would split the British and American armies apart, disrupt Allied supply lines, and possibly force the Western Allies to negotiate peace. The operation was given a code name, Operation Wacht am Rhein. The location of the attack was chosen very carefully. The Ardennes region had already played a dramatic role earlier in the war. In 1940, German panzer divisions had shocked the world by driving through these same forests during the Lightning Campaign of the Battle of France. Many Allied commanders believed the terrain was too difficult for large armored movements. Hitler hoped history could repeat itself. The Ardennes was a region of steep hills, narrow valleys, and thick forests. In winter, heavy snow and freezing temperatures could turn small roads into dangerous ice-covered paths. Large armies could not move freely here. Everything depended on a limited number of roads and crossroads. Whoever controlled those roads controlled the movement of entire divisions. And this was where the German plan became extremely fragile. German armored columns would have to follow strict timetables. Tank divisions, artillery units, and supply trucks all depended on narrow roads winding through forests and small villages. Even a minor delay could cause traffic jams that stretched for miles. If one column slowed down, everything behind it slowed down as well. Speed was the entire strategy. German planners believed the attack would catch the Allies completely off guard. The sector of the front chosen for the assault was considered relatively quiet. Many of the American units there were inexperienced divisions that had recently arrived in Europe. Others were exhausted formations resting after months of fighting. German intelligence believed these units would collapse quickly under the pressure of a massive armored attack. If that happened, the panzer divisions would break through within hours. They would push west without stopping, leaving isolated American pockets behind them. German commanders expected the Allied defensive line to crumble like a cracked wall. To make the surprise even greater, the attack was scheduled for mid-December, when poor winter weather would ground most Allied aircraft. Without air power dominating the skies, German armor would have a rare chance to move during daylight without constant attacks from fighter bombers. In the weeks before the offensive, German forces quietly gathered in the forests east of the front lines. Tanks were hidden under camouflage nets. Artillery pieces were moved into position at night. Entire divisions marched through snow-covered villages while strict radio silence was maintained. More than 200,000 German soldiers and nearly 900 tanks and assault guns were secretly assembled for the attack. The goal was nothing less than changing the course of the war in the West. On detailed German staff maps, dozens of towns were marked along the planned routes of advance. Each location had a specific time assigned for its capture. Some towns were expected to fall within hours. Others were considered minor obstacles that could be cleared quickly by following infantry. One of those towns was a small Belgian crossroads called St. Vith. At first glance, St. Vith did not look important. It was not a major city nor contained large military installations, but it sat at a critical intersection of several roads that connected the eastern Ardennes to the interior of Belgium. For German armored divisions moving west, those roads were essential. Still, most German planners assumed St. Vith would not cause serious problems. American forces in the area were expected to retreat quickly once the offensive began. German commanders believed their panzer divisions would capture the town within the first day of fighting. After that, the armored spearheads would continue moving west according to the carefully planned schedule. Everything depended on maintaining that schedule. If the roads remained open, the offensive might reach the Meuse River in just a few days. If the river crossings were captured, the road to Antwerp would be open, and if Antwerp fell, the Allied armies in Western Europe could be split in two. But if the timetable began to slip, the entire operation could collapse. Every hour mattered. Every crossroads mattered. And in a war where massive armies moved like machines across the landscape, even a small town could become a gear that stopped the entire mechanism. When the offensive finally began in the early morning darkness of December 16, 1944, artillery fire shattered the silence of the Ardennes. Thousands of shells crashed into American positions along the front, followed by waves of infantry and armored vehicles pushing through the forests. The massive battle that would later be known as the Battle of the Bulge had begun. German commanders believed the first days would bring rapid victories. Their armored columns were expected to surge forward through the narrow roads of the Ardennes like steel rivers. But there was one thing their carefully drawn maps could not predict. Some American units were not planning to retreat on schedule. And at one quiet crossroads town, a stubborn defense was about to begin that would slowly disrupt the precise timetable of Hitler's last great gamble. When German planners prepared their ambitious winter offensive in December 1944, their maps were filled with arrows, timetables, and objectives stretching deep into Belgium. Every armored column had a precise route. Every division had a schedule measured not just in days, but in hours. Speed was everything. If the German spearheads could move quickly enough through the Ardennes, they might reach the Meuse River before the Allies fully understood what was happening. But inside this massive plan, one small location quietly held enormous importance. That place was the Belgian town of St. Vith. At first glance, St. Vith looked like just another rural town surrounded by forests and rolling hills. Before the war, it was known mostly as a railway hub and a quiet regional center. Its population was small, and its buildings modest. Nothing about it suggested it could influence the movement of entire armies. Yet geography can turn ordinary places into strategic prizes. St. Vith sat at the intersection of several key roads that ran through the eastern Ardennes. These roads connected Germany to the deeper interior of Belgium and ultimately to the Meuse River. In a region where steep hills and dense forests limited movement, those few roads became lifelines for armored divisions. For German planners preparing the offensive that would become the Battle of the Bulge, this crossroads was extremely important. The German advance relied heavily on tanks and mechanized units. Unlike infantry, armored formations could not simply march through forests or climb steep slopes. Tanks required roads that were wide enough, solid enough, and direct enough to keep large columns moving at high speed. That meant crossroads like St. Vith were critical. If German forces controlled the town, their armored divisions could spread west along multiple routes, maintaining momentum.
But if the crossroads remained blocked or contested, traffic jams would form. Entire panzer columns could end up trapped behind stalled vehicles and burning wreckage. And in an operation where every hour counted, delays could become fatal to the entire plan. German staff officers understood this risk very clearly. Their operational timetables showed that St. Vith needed to fall quickly, ideally within the first day of the offensive. Once captured, German armored units would pass through the town and continue toward the Meuse without stopping. To them, the town was not expected to become a battlefield. It was simply another checkpoint along the route. But on the American side of the front, things were far less predictable. By late 1944, Allied forces had advanced so rapidly across France that their front lines had stretched thin across a vast area. Some sectors were heavily defended by experienced combat divisions. Others were guarded by units that were resting, reorganizing, or still gaining battlefield experience. The Ardennes sector fell into that second category. Many Allied commanders believed the Ardennes forests were unlikely to become the location of a major German attack. The terrain was difficult, the weather harsh, and the road network limited. For that reason, the area was often used as a quieter section of the line, where units could recover from earlier fighting. American forces stationed there were spread across long defensive positions. Among them were elements of the U.S. 8th Corps, which was responsible for defending a large portion of the Ardennes front. Some of these soldiers were veterans, but others had little combat experience. To German intelligence officers studying the situation, the region looked vulnerable. They believed that once the surprise attack began, American units would retreat quickly under the pressure of German armor. If that happened, towns like St. Vith would fall almost automatically as the defensive line collapsed. But war rarely unfolds exactly the way it looks on a map. Behind the American lines, reinforcements were already moving through the region, though not yet fully organized for a major battle. One of the officers soon involved in the defense of this area was Bruce C. Clark, a tough and experienced American commander known for his calm decision-making under pressure. Clark had spent years studying armored warfare and battlefield maneuver. He understood something that many planners on both sides were beginning to realize. In modern mechanized war, controlling roads could be just as important as controlling territory. When the German offensive finally began on December 16, 1944, the quiet forests of the Ardennes exploded with artillery fire. German infantry divisions pushed forward through the snow, while armored units prepared to break through the American lines. At first, the attack created confusion across the Allied front. Communication lines were disrupted. Reports from the front were incomplete. Some American units found themselves suddenly facing overwhelming forces moving through fog and snow. Yet, despite the surprise, many American defenders did not collapse the way German commanders had expected. In the sector around St. Vith, resistance began to stiffen. Small groups of American soldiers delayed German advances at roadblocks and defensive positions. Engineers destroyed bridges and blocked routes with obstacles. Artillery units fired on advancing columns, slowing their movement through the narrow valleys. Every small delay began to add up. German commanders had planned for rapid breakthroughs, but now their columns were encountering unexpected resistance at key points along the road network. Vehicles began bunching together along narrow forest roads, creating long lines of tanks, trucks, and half-tracks waiting to move forward. And as the fighting intensified, one thing became increasingly clear. St. Vith was no longer just a crossroads on a map. It was becoming a barrier standing directly in the path of the German advance. For the German offensive to maintain its speed, the town had to be captured quickly. Every hour spent fighting there threatened the carefully calculated timetable that the entire operation depended on. What German planners had expected to be a minor obstacle was slowly turning into a major problem. And as more American units moved into position around the town, the defense of St. Vith was beginning to take shape under leaders who had no intention of giving up the crossroads without a fight. The stage was now set for a battle that would not only decide the fate of a small Belgian town, but also determine whether Hitler's last great offensive could keep moving forward or begin losing the one thing it could never afford to lose: time.
When the German offensive burst across the Ardennes on the morning of December 16, 1944, the situation along the American front quickly descended into confusion. German artillery thundered across the frozen hills, infantry advanced through the forests, and armored columns pushed forward along the narrow road network. In many places, communication lines were cut, and American units suddenly found themselves fighting in isolation. German planners believed the shock alone would cause the Allied defense to collapse. According to their timetable, towns along the advance routes were supposed to fall quickly. Once the road network opened, the armored spearheads would surge west without stopping. But near the crossroads town of St. Vith, something unexpected was happening. Instead of collapsing, American units were beginning to organize a stubborn defense. The town sat at the center of several critical roads, and whoever controlled those roads controlled the movement of large formations across the eastern Ardennes. As German forces approached, American commanders realized that holding this crossroads, even temporarily, could slow the entire offensive. At the center of this developing defense was an officer who at the time was not widely known outside military circles: Bruce C. Clark. Clark was not a dramatic or flamboyant commander. He did not seek attention, and he rarely spoke in grand speeches. But among officers who served with him, he had a reputation for being calm, direct, and extremely practical under pressure. Born in 1901, Clark had spent decades in the U.S. Army, developing a deep understanding of armored warfare and battlefield coordination. By late 1944, he had gained valuable experience commanding armored units during the Allied push across Europe. What made Clark particularly effective was his ability to see the battlefield as a system of movement, roads, terrain, and timing. He understood that modern warfare was not only about firepower, it was also about controlling space and slowing the enemy's momentum. When reports of the German attack began pouring in, Clark quickly grasped the danger facing the region around St. Vith. German armored units were advancing rapidly through parts of the Ardennes, and if they captured the crossroads without delay, their columns could spread west along multiple roads. That would allow them to maintain the speed their entire plan depended on. But near the crossroads town of St. Vith, something unexpected was happening. Instead of collapsing, American units were beginning to organize a stubborn defense. The town sat at the center of several critical roads, and whoever controlled those roads controlled the movement of large formations across the eastern Ardennes. As German forces approached, American commanders realized that holding this crossroads, even temporarily, could slow the entire offensive. At the center of this developing defense was an officer who at the time was not widely known outside military circles: Bruce C. Clark. Clark was not a dramatic or flamboyant commander. He did not seek attention, and he rarely spoke in grand speeches. But among officers who served with him, he had a reputation for being calm, direct, and extremely practical under pressure. Born in 1901, Clark had spent decades in the U.S. Army, developing a deep understanding of armored warfare and battlefield coordination. By late 1944, he had gained valuable experience commanding armored units during the Allied push across Europe. What made Clark particularly effective was his ability to see the battlefield as a system of movement, roads, terrain, and timing.
He understood that modern warfare was not only about firepower, it was also about controlling space and slowing the enemy's momentum. When reports of the German attack began pouring in, Clark quickly grasped the danger facing the region around St. Vith. German armored units were advancing rapidly through parts of the Ardennes, and if they captured the crossroads without delay, their columns could spread west along multiple roads. That would allow them to maintain the speed their entire plan depended on. But near the crossroads town of St. Vith, something unexpected was happening. Instead of collapsing, American units were beginning to organize a stubborn defense. The town sat at the center of several critical roads, and whoever controlled those roads controlled the movement of large formations across the eastern Ardennes. As German forces approached, American commanders realized that holding this crossroads, even temporarily, could slow the entire offensive. At the center of this developing defense was an officer who at the time was not widely known outside military circles, Bruce C. Clark. Clark was not a dramatic or flamboyant commander. He did not seek attention, and he rarely spoke in grand speeches. But among officers who served with him, he had a reputation for being calm, direct, and extremely practical under pressure. Born in 1901, Clark had spent decades in the U.S. Army, developing a deep understanding of armored warfare and battlefield coordination. By late 1944, he had gained valuable experience commanding armored units during the Allied push across Europe. What made Clark particularly effective was his ability to see the battlefield as a system of movement, roads, terrain, and timing. He understood that modern warfare was not only about firepower, it was also about controlling space and slowing the enemy's momentum. When reports of the German attack began pouring in, Clark quickly grasped the danger facing the region around St. Vith. German armored units were advancing rapidly through parts of the Ardennes, and if they captured the crossroads without delay, their columns could spread west along multiple roads. That would allow them to maintain the speed their entire plan depended on. But near the crossroads town of St. Vith, something unexpected was happening. Instead of collapsing, American units were beginning to organize a stubborn defense. The town sat at the center of several critical roads, and whoever controlled those roads controlled the movement of large formations across the eastern Ardennes. As German forces approached, American commanders realized that holding this crossroads, even temporarily, could slow the entire offensive. At the center of this developing defense was an officer who at the time was not widely known outside military circles, Bruce C. Clark. Clark was not a dramatic or flamboyant commander. He did not seek attention, and he rarely spoke in grand speeches. But among officers who served with him, he had a reputation for being calm, direct, and extremely practical under pressure. Born in 1901, Clark had spent decades in the U.S. Army, developing a deep understanding of armored warfare and battlefield coordination. By late 1944, he had gained valuable experience commanding armored units during the Allied push across Europe. What made Clark particularly effective was his ability to see the battlefield as a system of movement, roads, terrain, and timing. He understood that modern warfare was not only about firepower, it was also about controlling space and slowing the enemy's momentum. When reports of the German attack began pouring in, Clark quickly grasped the danger facing the region around St. Vith. German armored units were advancing rapidly through parts of the Ardennes, and if they captured the crossroads without delay, their columns could spread west along multiple roads. That would allow them to maintain the speed their entire plan depended on. But near the crossroads town of St. Vith, something unexpected was happening. Instead of collapsing, American units were beginning to organize a stubborn defense. The town sat at the center of several critical roads, and whoever controlled those roads controlled the movement of large formations across the eastern Ardennes. As German forces approached, American commanders realized that holding this crossroads, even temporarily, could slow the entire offensive. At the center of this developing defense was an officer who at the time was not widely known outside military circles, Bruce C. Clark. Clark was not a dramatic or flamboyant commander. He did not seek attention, and he rarely spoke in grand speeches. But among officers who served with him, he had a reputation for being calm, direct, and extremely practical under pressure. Born in 1901, Clark had spent decades in the U.S. Army, developing a deep understanding of armored warfare and battlefield coordination. By late 1944, he had gained valuable experience commanding armored units during the Allied push across Europe. What made Clark particularly effective was his ability to see the battlefield as a system of movement, roads, terrain, and timing. He understood that modern warfare was not only about firepower, it was also about controlling space and slowing the enemy's momentum. When reports of the German attack began pouring in, Clark quickly grasped the danger.
By the third day of the German offensive in the Ardennes, something was beginning to go wrong. On paper, the operation had been designed like a perfectly timed machine. Armored divisions were supposed to punch through the Allied lines, capture key crossroads, and race west before the enemy could react. Every unit had a schedule. Every road had a purpose. If the columns kept moving, the offensive might reach the Meuse River in just a few days. But near the crossroads town of St. Vith, the machine had begun to slow down. Instead of collapsing quickly, American forces had built a stubborn defensive line around the town. What had been expected to fall within hours was now holding out day after day. Each hour that passed forced German commanders to rethink their routes, reposition their units, and push their soldiers harder to maintain the momentum of the attack. The battle around St. Vith was becoming a fight not just for territory, but for time. For German armored columns moving through the Ardennes, time was everything. Tanks, half-tracks, artillery, and supply trucks all depended on the same narrow road network. When those roads were blocked by resistance, destroyed bridges, or damaged vehicles, entire columns could grind to a halt. And that was exactly what the American defenders were trying to achieve. Under the leadership of Bruce C. Clark and other commanders coordinating the defense, American units focused on delaying the enemy rather than meeting them in open battle. Infantry units fought from wooded hillsides and defensive ridges overlooking the main approaches to the town. Artillery units targeted German vehicles moving along the roads. Engineers placed obstacles and demolished bridges wherever possible. Each small action slowed the German advance a little more. At first, German commanders believed these delays were temporary. Their forces still had powerful armored divisions in the area, including elements of the 6th Panzer Army and other formations driving west through the Ardennes. But the geography of the region worked against them. The forests around St. Vith were dense and the valleys narrow. Tanks could not spread out across the landscape the way they might on open plains. Instead, they had to move in long columns along a limited number of roads. When the lead elements encountered resistance, the vehicles behind them had no choice but to wait. Soon, the roads east of the town were crowded with vehicles. Lines of tanks, trucks, and artillery stretched through the forests as German units struggled to move forward. Drivers waited inside freezing vehicles while engineers cleared wreckage or attempted to repair damaged routes. Sometimes a single destroyed vehicle could block an entire road for hours. From the air, if the weather had been clear enough to see, those roads would have looked like frozen rivers of steel. Meanwhile, American defenders continued fighting with remarkable determination.
Even when German forces pushed close to the town, the defenders regrouped and established new positions on surrounding hills. Artillery fire continued striking German formations trying to approach the crossroads. For Clark and his commanders, the goal remained simple: make every German advance take longer than planned. The original German timetable had expected rapid breakthroughs during the first days of the offensive, but now that schedule was beginning to unravel. German officers studying their maps noticed that key objectives were falling behind schedule. Units that should have already been far to the west were still struggling around St. Vith. Other formations had been forced to reroute onto secondary roads to bypass the resistance. Those detours created even more congestion. The longer the battle continued, the more pressure German commanders felt from above. The offensive ordered by Adolf Hitler depended on speed above all else. If the armored spearheads could not maintain momentum, the Allies would gain precious time to bring reinforcements into the battle. And time was exactly what the American defenders were buying. Even small delays became strategically important. A few lost hours could allow additional Allied units to arrive in the region. A single day might allow commanders elsewhere to reorganize their defenses, and if the weather improved, Allied aircraft would soon return to the skies over the Ardennes. Despite these growing problems, German forces continued launching powerful attacks towards St. Vith. Tanks pushed forward through the forests, while infantry tried to outflank American defensive positions. Fighting often took place in snow-covered woods, where visibility was limited and confusion was constant. The defenders faced overwhelming pressure, but they continued to resist. By December 20th, the battle around the crossroads had turned into one of the fiercest struggles of the entire offensive. German units were finally beginning to close in on the town from several directions. The American defensive line was under enormous strain. Yet even as the situation became more dangerous, the delaying action had already achieved something extremely important. The German advance had lost its precise rhythm. Columns that were supposed to be far ahead were still trying to clear routes through the eastern Ardennes. Some units had run low on fuel while waiting in traffic. Others had been forced to change their plans entirely as resistance slowed their progress. The carefully planned schedule of the offensive was slipping away, hour by hour. Eventually, the American defenders would be forced to withdraw from St. Vith to avoid being surrounded, but by the time that moment arrived, the town had already served its purpose. For several critical days, a determined defense had held one of the most important crossroads in the Ardennes. And those lost days were something the German offensive could never recover. Because as German commanders struggled to regain their momentum, Allied forces across the region were already beginning to reorganize and prepare for the next phase of the battle. The massive conflict that history would remember as the Battle of the Bulge was still unfolding, but thanks to the stubborn desistance at a small crossroads town, the clock was no longer working in Germany's favor.
By late December 1944, the fighting around the crossroads town of St. Vith had reached a critical point. For several days, American defenders had held their ground against powerful German attacks, slowing the advance of armored columns that were supposed to be racing west through the Ardennes. But no defensive position can hold forever when surrounded by larger forces. German units were gradually closing in from multiple directions, and the American troops defending the town faced the growing danger of being cut off completely. Commanders on the ground understood that if they stayed too long, entire formations could be trapped and destroyed. The decision was finally made to withdraw. It was not a retreat caused by panic or collapse. Instead, it was a carefully organized movement designed to save the defending forces while preserving the most valuable thing they had gained during the battle: time. Under the pressure of continued German attacks, American units slowly pulled back from the town and established new defensive lines farther west.
The town itself would soon fall into German hands. But by the time German troops finally entered St. Vith, something important had already changed. The offensive was no longer moving according to the plan designed by Adolf Hitler. From the very beginning, the success of the operation had depended on speed. German armored divisions were supposed to break through quickly, capture key road junctions, and continue west without hesitation. The longer the offensive took, the more difficult it would become. And the battle for St. Vith had taken far longer than anyone on the German side expected. Instead of falling within hours, the crossroads had remained contested for several critical days. During that time, German armored units were forced to slow down, reorganize, and sometimes reroute their advance. Long traffic jams formed along the narrow Ardennes roads as tanks, trucks, and artillery struggled to move forward. Those lost hours could never be recovered. Meanwhile, the delay had given Allied commanders across the region valuable time to respond to the surprise attack. Reinforcements were already moving toward the front. Additional American divisions began arriving to strengthen the defensive lines. Supply routes were reorganized, and new plans were formed to stop the German advance before it could reach the Meuse River. Perhaps the most famous struggle during the offensive was unfolding farther south in the town of Bastogne. There, American forces were surrounded by German troops but refused to surrender, creating one of the most dramatic moments of the entire campaign. Soon, another major development began to shape the battle. The powerful U.S. Third Army, commanded by George S. Patton, executed a rapid and unexpected turn northward to relieve the besieged defenders at Bastogne. Patton's maneuver became one of the most famous operational movements of the war. But actions like that required time to organize, and time had been bought in places like St. Vith. When historians later examined the events of the Battle of the Bulge, they discovered that the German offensive had already begun losing its momentum during those early days. The delays caused by stubborn American resistance at key road junctions prevented German armored spearheads from moving as quickly as planned. Without that speed, the entire strategy became far more difficult to achieve. Fuel shortages began affecting German units. Traffic congestion slowed their ability to shift forces, and as the days passed, the weather that had protected the German advance from Allied aircraft began to clear. Once the skies opened, Allied air power returned with devastating effect. Fighter bombers attacked German vehicles along the crowded roads of the Ardennes, destroying tanks, trucks, and supply convoys. The offensive that had begun with such dramatic surprise was now facing pressure from every direction. By early January 1945, it had become clear that Germany's last major offensive in the West had failed. German forces were gradually pushed back toward the positions they had started from weeks earlier. The massive gamble had cost Germany thousands of soldiers, hundreds of armored vehicles, and precious resources that could never be replaced. For the Allies, the victory came at a heavy price as well. The battle was one of the bloodiest fought by American forces during the entire war in Europe. Yet the outcome also confirmed something important about the nature of modern warfare. Sometimes the most decisive victories do not come from dramatic breakthroughs or spectacular offensives. Sometimes they come from smaller actions that quietly disrupt the enemy's plans. The defense of St. Vith was one of those moments. The town itself was eventually lost and its buildings heavily damaged by the fighting, but the defenders had accomplished exactly what their commanders intended. They had delayed powerful armored offensive at a critical crossroads during the most important days of the battle. That delay helped slow the German timetable, allowing Allied forces across the region to regroup and respond to the attack. At the center of that defense was a commander who had understood the importance of time from the very beginning, Bruce C. Clark. He did not become as famous as some other generals of the war, and the battle for St. Vith was often overshadowed by more widely known events like the siege of Bastogne. Yet many historians later recognized that the stubborn resistance around the crossroads played a vital role in disrupting the momentum of the German offensive. Because the plan designed by Hitler depended on precision and speed, and once that speed was lost, the outcome of the battle slowly began to shift. In the frozen forests of the Ardennes, a small town had quietly interfered with one of the most ambitious military gambles of the entire war. And in modern warfare, sometimes the difference between victory and failure is measured not in miles or armies, but in hours.